It provides a cultural opportunity for students as well as the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard and the New Orleans area.
And now, here's your host, Mr. Curtis Mannings.
Greetings and welcome to the Nunez History Lecture Series. This is the first special high school presentation, so we really appreciate everybody give a hand for Chalmette High School and Andrew Jackson High School. I would like to thank Doris Voce and Beverly Larson for helping to make this a possibility. They're with the St. Bernard Parish Schools, and also Dr. Thomas Warner for providing the lunch, which is going to be a great lunch afterwards, as well as the transportation and the facilities, of course. And thanks to Barbara Barbay for helping arrange all the logistics. In fact, let's give her a hand. And today is going to be a great example of cultural and intellectual entertainment, but also some good solid history. Ron Chapman is going to be giving the history of Louisiana wetlands, and so it's a good way to fit into the curriculum as well as to make history current to tell you about today. So without further wait, I'll go and introduce Mr. Ron Chapman.
Greetings, how are you? Microphone working? Great. It's a pleasure having you here over at Nunez Community College, and I hope some of you all consider coming here when your time over at Chalmette and Andrew Jackson is over with. Today we're going to talk about Louisiana wetlands. You all live in Louisiana, the great state of Louisiana, but what you probably don't realize is how much we're losing our state. And that's what this lecture is about. You know, it's going to begin with a discussion of how the state was formed, and then it's going to go into a transition showing how we're gradually losing it. We'll talk about it being a vanishing treasure. This is a poem written by Annette Accomando, who's a Chalmatian and a member of our faculty. There, it is time to cry, moss sweeps and herons fly, squirrels flee, opossums sigh, deer relocate, cypress die, tall gray trunks haunt the azure sky, the lifeless logs become their own tombstones, as no one buries these dead. Few lament their loss. Materialism and capitalism reign supreme. Man makes tearless excuses. A ship channel is their dream. There is money to be made. There are jobs to be had. It is a time to cry. Those of you all who drive down Parish Road probably recognize that site. That was once a vast cypress swamp. We'll get into it in a little bit. This is Louisiana here. And this is the entire basin here. This is the United States. The Mississippi River drains this entire area. So all the sediment, all the waterways coming down through this area run through tributaries, the Ohio, Missouri River, down in here through out to the mouth of the Mississippi. I want you to take special note of this area here. This is called the Mississippi embayment, okay? This is a close-up view of Louisiana, which shows, again, you can see here, this is the delta region that's referred to of the Mississippi River. This was its traditional flood zone before we built levees. This is a Red River tying in between it. The two of them come down and extend, and they create this entire marshland, the southern part of Louisiana, okay? This is what we're losing, is this entire region down here. It's a young land. Louisiana is one of the youngest states of the Union, geologically. In fact, the coastal plain, the very bottom of Louisiana, is only 7,500 years old. When you think in geological terms, you know, you think of millions and millions of years. Here you're looking at only 7,500. It actually formed as a result of the ice ages and the great ice age melt of 12,000 years ago. We'll get into that in a little more detail. The Mississippi River is the prime mover. It's the reason that we are what we are today. And if you notice, because of the Mississippi River, all the land was created from sediment that washed down through this tributary system. There really are no rocks. Everything's mud around here. which made it very difficult for the local Native Americans because they didn't have the flint that they needed to make arrowheads and things of that sort. They had to resort to trade with other tribes to get the essentials. But at the same time, this has provided us with a rich harvest of minerals, sulfur, salt, and oil, all part of the whole geological process of creating what is Louisiana. Location: Louisiana extends further south than most states of the Union, the only exclusions being Texas and Florida. It's kind of hard to imagine this, but Louisiana is on the same latitude as New Delhi, India, Shanghai, China, and Cairo, Egypt. When you think of Egypt, you think of the sands. And you realize that we're surrounded by so much water. It's the heat of the sun is the same, and the combination with the water creates this humidity that we live in. We know what that's like all summer long. Right. It's 290 miles east-west. It's 275 miles north-south. 48,523 square miles. It's the 31st largest state. 4,000 square miles is lakes. There's 650 rivers, bayous, and streams. This gives you an indication of just exactly how wet Louisiana is. 25% of the state is water. And when a hurricane comes, that number goes up appreciably. Sometimes just a heavy rain can make it go up appreciably. 769 miles of coastline. This played a very important role in our history, in fact, because smuggling has always been part of Louisiana's history, from rum running back in the 1930s to Jean Lafitte as a pirate in the 1800s to before that with some of the Frenchmen. Some facts. The crookedest river in the world. It took 1,300 miles to cover the same ground a crow could fly in 675. Mark Twain. By the way, Mark Twain's real name, Samuel Clemens, was a Mississippi River pilot. He operated the Mississippi River from New Orleans all the way up to Cairo, Illinois. This is an interesting factor. The Mississippi brings 400 million tons of sediment into the Gulf each year. Now, at one time, before there were levees, the Mississippi River used to overflow every spring, and all that fresh water would fill in this entire valley, and all that sediment that was coming down would settle down in and create the land. Okay? But now, since we've created the levee system that we have, which began in 1721 to protect us so we don't get washed away, all that sediment and that fresh water which replenished Louisiana is now running straight off the coast. How much is that? It's a pile of earth, a pile of mud, 2 miles square and 150 feet high that we lose each year off the continental shelf. This is land that used to be distributed over Louisiana. This is land that used to create Louisiana. It discharges, look at this figure, 375 billion gallons of water a day pass right by your doorstep out here in New Orleans, fresh water. No streams really flow into the Mississippi River except for major rivers. The reason for that is because of this process of flooding. As it floods and overflows, it drops the sediment, so the area closest to the river is highest. If you notice, when there's a heavy rain and people coming in from town, you don't take Judge Perez, you take St. Bernard Highway. Why? Because St. Bernard Highway is dry where Judge Perez might be underwater. Reason being is the closer you get to the river, the higher the land is because of this process. It's different from rivers you'll find in other areas where they're cut in low and they're the low area. 20% of its flow today goes into the Atchafalaya Basin. The Mississippi River has been trying to change its course for a long time. And it's the efforts of man through the new river control structure that cause this river to stay where it's going. If the river does what it wants to do and would flow down the Atchafalaya Basin, the city of New Orleans would become a saltwater port, and we would have no fresh water because we depend upon fresh water coming down to supply us for everything, for our showers, for our drinking water, for whatever purpose we need it, for cooking. That would all disappear. It tried in 1973 to change its course. There was a massive flood. And as this water came down, the old river control structure was sitting there. I don't know if you all have ever seen that film with that bridge that oscillates and breaks apart on TV sometimes. It reached, it's called harmonics because the wind created the harmonics. Harmonics set up on the old river control structure where it literally started shaking and vibrating, and they thought it was going to collapse. If it had, the Mississippi River was going to change its course. The Corps of Engineers spent a lot of money after that trying to see to it that this didn't happen again. Some more facts. Loss of wetlands is one of the greatest causes of permanent landscape change in America. This is something that's now only recently being recognized. 25% of all of America's wetlands are right here in Louisiana. 40% of the lower 48 salt marshes are right here in Louisiana. But 80% of the national wetland loss is also here in Louisiana. Our state is disappearing. Between 25 and 35 square miles of land is lost every year through erosion. And it's not being rebuilt because the natural processes of the Mississippi River overflowing its boundaries and spreading all this fresh water and silt is no longer taking place. But storms and hurricanes are coming in, and there's a variety of other human and non-human factors that come into play which are causing this process. Think about that. A football field every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year is what we're losing. Prior to 1980, we actually lost 40 square miles. Think about that, the size of that loss and how much this state's disappearing. 3/4 of the population lives less than 1 foot above sea level. So when you have a storm out in the Gulf that's coming in and it threatens to have a 25 or 30 foot tidal surge, you realize how serious that is. This is the Ice Age melt. You seem to think, geologists going back, and of course you can't be 100% sure on this, but this is about the way the river systems ran. Then when the Ice Age formed, the Great Ice Sheet formed here. Came all the way down to this point here, right around Illinois. Okay? What happened 12,000 years ago, the Ice Age started melting. And if you look, this is the ice cap here. And these lines here, 72 million years ago, 50 million years ago, 18 million years ago, and you get down to the present stage. This is the embayment. This was all water. But if you look at it, as the Ice Age started melting, so you could say global warming began way back then, as the Ice Age started melting, the edge here is the Ohio River, the edge here is the Missouri River, and all that started flowing down. And then every spring, the water rushed down carrying all the ground sediment from underneath that ice cap and overflowed it and filled it in. And over the process of millions of years, gradually this coastline, this area was created and filled in until it created the current state of Louisiana. That is how the process began. That is how Louisiana was formed. And that is why this last section here is only 7,500 years old. Mississippi River Basin, this will give you an idea of what's drawn. All the water, the watershed, from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachian Mountains, all the way into Canada, all the water that drops as rain or snow finds its way somehow right past the doorstep of the city of New Orleans through this heavily integrated system. This is only a few of the major rivers. If you look at the actual numbers of rivers, there's more than you can possibly count. This will give you an idea of the waterways in Louisiana and how varied they are and how many they are. If you see these waterways coming here, a lot of times you see that they have flooding north of the lake, and you figure, how does it flood north of the lake? If any of you all have taken a drive down from Memphis, Tennessee, or just from Jackson, Mississippi, you'll notice you're driving down the whole time. All that water in the rain that drains up here in Mississippi is coming down this direction. It comes down these waterways and tries to feed into Lake Pontchartrain. And what happens when all that water rushes in here, it's just too much for these little streams to handle, so they overflow. So that accounts for the flooding here. The flooding down this area here is created by storms and tidal surges. Okay? But if you look at something, look at this. You can see the history of Louisiana simply because almost all the major cities are located on a waterway. Because during the times when you had the Native Americans in the early French and Spanish period, you didn't really have roads. It's very difficult to go through this area. It's so marshy in so many areas, or hilly when you get up to the hill country, that waterways became the means of transportation. So our cities today reflect that early history. This is parts of a river, because since the Mississippi River plays such an important role in the development, I wanted to show you this. This is the floodplain. These are bluffs on either side. And this is how the Mississippi River would run, okay? Now, a river is a dynamic thing. It's not static. As it's running, on the outside, its water's moving fast. On the inside, it's moving slower. So the idea of these dotted lines is showing that it actually builds land on the inside, because as it slows down, it drops sediment. But then it cuts away land on the high side here. So as a result, the Mississippi River is like a snake. If you could look at it in time-lapse photography over time, it's wiggling around like a snake. Sometimes, when this tide builds up, it'll rupture its own natural levee. And when that happens, it's called a crevasse, which is a break in the levee. And this is called a crevasse splay because what happens when it breaks, it spreads itself out, okay? And the water flows out this way, and it builds up this section of land. Sometimes the crevasse will break through one bend and actually approach the other bend and break through here. When it does that, the river has now effectively changed its course, and that's what creates Oxbow Lakes, False River, places like that. If you look at a map and you'll see that. These are areas that have been left out, you see? They call them Oxbow Lakes because they're shaped like an oxbow. As you can see, this is a natural levee here. This is alluvial soil at the bottom. You can see this rise here. That shows how the natural inclination of the land is because of the yearly floods of the natural river system. This is another view of the same thing, showing display. Here it gives you a better idea of a cypress swamp, the marsh area. Bays are basically created when this overflows, fills in a hollow, and then when the river goes back into its boundaries again, when the river changes, when the tides change, when the seasons change, it'll leave this area filled with water. Down here you see as the river runs its way down, it gets to the mouth of the river and it spreads out. Because it spreads out, it slows down. And when it slows down, it drops all this sand here, and that's what creates a bar, a sandbar. The Chandelier Islands are a sandbar. Mississippi deltas. This is going to be interesting. Have any of you all ever washed a car? I'm sure you have, right? Ever made the mistake of setting up the hose, turning the hose on, and all of a sudden you see that hose whipping around and you got to kind of walk down the end of the hose to get it so you don't get all wet? Mississippi River does the same thing. What it's been doing is whipping back and forth throughout its history. This is the first one here. It's the 7,500 to 5,000 years ago. Second one, you see it moved over here. Third one, it ran right through St. Bernard Parish. And that sandbar that was at the mouth of that river created the Chandelier Islands, Grand Gosher, and all these islands along up in here. That was part of the old system. That's why I talk about we're going to rebuild the Barrier Islands. The Barrier Islands were created by the Mississippi River's delta. So you can go back and try to build them if you wish, but you don't have the dynamic forces that you need to bring it back the way it originally was. Then it whipped back over here, 4. Then it came back over here, 5. 6 is where it wants to be. But we're not letting it go there because we've got all these investments in cities and towns and industries along the river, so we've created a vast levee system to try to control this river. This is another view of the same thing, so you can see how it whips about. And in the process of doing that, that is what's created the whole shape, this whole southern part of Louisiana, is the dynamics of this river whipping around. So by stopping it, we've created our own situation where these areas now can start eroding because they're not getting this replenishing force of land and fresh water. This is again showing a crevasse splay. If you look at it, some of you all go hunting and fishing nowadays. In the old days we used to use maps. Now you have photographs. I'm sure you guys out there fishing have seen the photographs, the satellite photographs that you use to navigate with. These are the splays. This is what a splay would do. When it ruptured the levee, it would spread out and it would fill it out. So this is Baptiste Colette, 1874, Cupid's Gap, 1862, Garden Island, 1891, West Bay, 1838. You notice you don't see too much recent because we've carried the levees all the way down, and as we know, we got rocks going out there. So as a result, the Mississippi River, even this far down, can't flow out. So what's happening is instead of building this continually each year, this area is now starting to erode more and more and more. Basic divisions of Louisiana. So taking all this into consideration, geologically, what you have is what's the uplands here and here. This area here in particular is especially gorgeous if you've ever been up in Tunica Hills. It's all hills. You got about 300-foot valleys, waterfalls. It's like the Smoky Mountains. It's absolutely gorgeous. I used to backpack there when I was in college. This here is the lowlands and plains where the Mississippi River would flood. In the Great Flood of 1927, when the river completely overflowed its boundaries, it overflowed from Baton Rouge all the way to Lafayette. From here all the way down was completely underwater in 1927. That was one of the reasons why they built the levee system as strong and as high as they did. In this area down here of our swamplands, this is the area that is the most vulnerable. When you look at a marsh, this is the distribution of the marshes. Here's the river coming down. Remember, in the old days, all that fresh water used to run down. When it ran down, it filled this area here and created a freshwater marsh. This area along the edge here is intruded with all the salt water that's starting to come up. And in between, where the two mix, you have the brackish marsh. The interplay of all these forces together, which create our estuaries. This is what's necessary for oysters, for shrimp, for trout, for fish, everything you can possibly imagine, all the seafood, crabs. It's an interplay of the different stages in their lives. They'll either go to fresh, to brackish, to salt. This is what makes our economy, our seafood economy, so powerful. This is what's being damaged because as the salt marsh goes higher and higher in, and the freshwater marsh is not being refed, the whole ecology of this area is changing. And that's what's the dynamics there are changing our economy as well as our coastline. Now, let's talk for a second about wetlands loss. The areas of greatest wetland loss are here in Tampa, Mobile, up around Mobile Bay. The last few hurricanes that went through there did a lot of damage. Galveston Island, but look at this. This is why Louisiana is so vulnerable to wetlands losses. This area here, if you look at these maps, you see this is a map of Louisiana, and this here is the Breton Sound Basin, this little red area. This is it cut away. What you can see is 1956, what was gained, what was lost, to 78, what was gained and what was lost. The red areas and the tan areas are losses. So you can see, look how much we've gone lost over here. Look at how much we've lost here. Look at this when you get to the mouth. That's all lost. That used to be all land. And if any of you all go fishing out that way, you know what I'm talking about. This area here is the Barataria Basin. Look at the losses up in Barataria Basin. The gains are so few in comparison to the losses. This is Terrebonne Basin. Again, there's areas that are being built up, but for the most part, the losses are astronomical. The only area that's being built up is the Atchafalaya Basin by Grand Lake because of the force of the Mississippi changing its course and trying to drive in that area. This is an interesting graphic. This is basically what the Louisiana coastline looked like in 1839. This is what it looked like in 1870. This is what it looks like in 1993. Think about that. Look how much is lost. And now you know when a hurricane comes, because the city of New Orleans is right here. This is the Mr. Go. This is the Industrial Canal. This is Chalmette. Look at this. The Gulf is here. It's there. All the way up to here. This is the only reason you have land here is because of the levee system. It's being eroded completely around us. This is a satellite photograph of that area to prove it. It's not just a drawing on a map. Here's the city of New Orleans. Here's Chalmette. Here's the Mr. Go. Here's the Intercoastal Canal, Lake Bourne. You can see, look, the coastline of Lake Bourne is just deteriorating completely. This whole area here was once cypress forest. It's gone. Saltwater intrusion is coming in and taking it all away. Human impact? The causes of it are both human and beyond human control. The oil and gas industry, the timber industry, and areas of dead zones have had the greatest impact on us. And it's an amazing picture. Look at that for a second. Each little dot of purple is a gas well. Each little dot of orange is an offshore oil rig. And these little lines of spider web are the pipelines that connect it all. Isn't it amazing, the impact here? Look at this. And the reason that's important is because of this. To get to each pipeline, they got to dig a pipeline canal. So they dig themselves a canal to get to it. This is a dead end. They drill their well, they get their pipeline, and they take the spoil and they throw the spoil on either side. What it does is it cuts it off so the water can't flow. This is 1945. This is the same area in 1998. You can see here's that bend. They've added more canals, but because of this, look how much has eroded and disappeared between the two. This is the dead zone. I don't know if you've heard a lot about this or not, but the problem with the dead zone is they're discovering that there's areas of dead zones where fish and everything are dying, crabs and all, and they couldn't figure out what it is. Now they seem to think, this is Syria at this point, but they seem to think it comes from nitrogen. We use nitrogen for fertilizer. So remember we talked about that vast amount of land that was drained by the Mississippi River coming down. What that does is it's draining all the farmland, and they put nitrogen in the ground in order to produce crops as fertilizer. This nitrogen gets into the waterway, washes down the Mississippi River. The current takes it away from the Mississippi River because there's a current that runs in this direction, east to west. It fills it in this area. With all the nitrogen in the water then, nitrogen is a fertilizer, algae, which is a plant, grows, great big algae plumes come up, and then when they die and they settle down to the bottom, they cut off the oxygen, so everything without oxygen becomes asphyxiated in that area. So we have another problem besides just on the land, we have problems in the water as well. Nutria. Our dear friend, Myocastor corpus, mouse beaver. You all seen them out there. I meant to bring a skin, but it hadn't finished thawing out yet. I was working it. One of my students brought it to me, and it's packed in salt. I've been trying to skin it. Initially, they were brought in from Bolivia and Argentina in the 1930s. The point of bringing them in was to try to come up with an alternate means of fur for the fur industry. Now, legend has it that at Avery Island, the owner of Avery Island brought them in there, and he was working with the nutria, trying to see how they would reproduce and how they would work for the industry. And then a hurricane came and they got loose in the marsh. But there's other stories. The State Department of Wildlife and Fisheries claims this isn't so, but I've talked to some old-time trappers who have since passed away who told me back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, they used to bring out boats with cages with males and females in them and actually plant them out in the marsh. The idea being the Germans were heavily involved in wanting to import these particular skins, so let's populate the area and reinvigorate the fur trade. They're a semi-aquatic mammal that resembles a rat. Anybody who knows them knows exactly what I'm talking about. But think about this. They breed year-round. Remember, Louisiana doesn't really have a winter, right? We got outside, it's cold. It's about as close to winter as you're going to get. They mature in 3 to 9 months. They have a litter from 1 to 13 animals. Okay? And the gestation period is only 130 days. Gestation period means time between impregnation and time of giving birth. So you can see they literally multiply like rats. They were introduced by McElhaney at Avery Island of the Tabasco fame as a fur-bearing animals. They escaped in a hurricane and also to spread. I kind of covered that already. The impact? There are over 20 million nutria right now in Louisiana. They're tearing up our marshes, and that's why with the fur industry being depressed the way it is because of all the activism against wearing furs, you know, with PETA and all these sorts of organizations that are out there, nobody wears furs anymore because it's not considered fashionable, so as a result, there's no control over their population, so they are multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. They eat nearly 1/3 of their body weight in vegetation each day. So think about the impact. That's why the state of Louisiana has now put a $4 bounty on each one. So if any of you all get licensed, want to make some money this summer, talk to the State Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, see if you can get a license. And I'm not sure, I think you can just produce the tail or something like that, and they'll give you $4 a piece for them. They're all over the place, so you can make a couple $100 in a week real easy by getting rid of nutria. They've now become a pest. They eat the roots, because they don't just graze the grass at top, they dig down and eat the roots out, and they kill the potential for the marsh to grow. The marsh dies, and when the marsh dies, it sinks, and they refer to ponding, because then water rushes into the area and sits there. So instead of having land, you have ponding. They've destroyed nearly 100,000 acres of marsh to date. Think about the size of that area. In Barataria Basin alone, nearly 128 square miles have been destroyed by nutria. They're one of the greatest causes of wetlands loss outside of oil canals, things of that sort. What do they look like? Well, you got Woodrow from the Zephyrs. He's even got his yellow teeth. That's our friendly version of a nutria. Here's the real thing. You can see he is a rat. Nutria corpo. Gets attention from Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay. This is an example of introducing an animal into an area where it's not natural to have them there, and they take over. The zebra mussel is doing the same thing, and now I understand there's this large snail that's about the size of a softball that's starting to now introduce itself from China and starting to spread itself around in the United States. This is a photograph of one of our furry little friends. Not the most attractive animal you've ever seen, huh? And this is the area that they're devastating the most. They're in the southern marshes here. This is an example of what they do. What they did was here, they went out into a healthy marsh and they fenced it off. Drove with these 4 poles in the ground, dug down, put the fence line down there and walked away. The nutria came behind them, and this is what the nutria did to the marsh. This is the area they couldn't get to. Isn't that amazing? They just travel in a hurry, and you can't frighten them up. If you go up next to them in a pirogue, they won't even get out your way. So hunting is pretty easy, so if you decide to do it. This is an area that they hit. You can see this area back up in here they hadn't got to yet. This is the area that they had gotten to. Look, this is what ponding, the beginning of ponding looks like, how they've dug it all out. Another problem we got is Mr. Go. We got that right out here. The Corps of Engineers started building that some time ago. The Mississippi River Gulf Outlet. The idea was traveling up the Mississippi River, you got to wind back and forth, you got to fight the current, it's extremely difficult. So why don't we build a canal through St. Bernard Parish that'll link into the industrial canal and to the Mississippi River that way? The idea was actually first floated in 1873, but it didn't really catch on until the 1950s. It's a 76-mile long canal. It was started in 1957, ended in 65. When it was dug, it was 500 feet wide as a navigation canal. Trouble is the ground there is so soft and so vulnerable, it's like coffee grounds. It was supposed to be maintained at 36 feet. It was a straight line to the Inner Harbor Canal in New Orleans. It was supposed to economically develop us. All down the Gulf Outlet was supposed to be shipyards and industries and everything you can imagine. This is going to be the best thing that ever happened to St. Bernard Parish. It was cut through 4 natural levees and a freshwater marsh. Now think about that. That's those 4 levees that were created, natural levees by the Mississippi River when it flowed through this way. That's what kept the salt water from coming in. That's what kept the tidal surges from coming in. That's what protected us from hurricanes and everything else with these natural levees. When they cut through them, they opened up a straight expressway for the Gulf to come right into St. Bernard Parish. 40,000 acres of mature cypress trees died because of the salt water that came in. Trees can't grow in salt. It killed off crayfish, mink, muskrat, the seafood industry, and the marsh itself. 1957, Ed Roy, who is the editor of the St. Bernard Voice, which, by the way, you should be proud because the St. Bernard Voice, I believe now, is the oldest newspaper in the same family in Louisiana. It's been the same family since 1890, which is 114 years now. And the present editor, E.M. Roy's dad, was writing about it. And he wrote, when they started building this thing, is St. Bernard doomed? He was frightened for the future of St. Bernard because everybody was all excited about the economic development. But he was concerned. At that time, it was called the Tidewater Canal. This is the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet. It runs all the way up. Here we are. So you can see at one time when this marsh was healthy, we had a lot of land between us and a storm and a tidal surge. But with all this disappearing and this river, basically a man-made river, running into the back of us, we're extremely vulnerable. The levees here are about 18.5 feet high. When they get past the Paris Road Bridge, which we affectionately call the Green Bridge, even though it's gray, on this side is 14.5 feet high. Now, when I had a levee profile, requested a levee profile, I found out that, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And a levee is only as strong as its lowest point. That actually this 18.5-foot levee had areas that were about 17 feet. When you got to this 14-foot section here, there were areas that were 12.5 feet. But then how do you measure a levee? The Corps of Engineers has a medallion they use to measure from. When I asked the question, when was the last time you measured the height of the medallion? Because the land's subsiding. They said 1984. So they've gone back just this last 2 years and starting doing GPS measurements for the height. They're estimating that in the last 20 years that may have fallen 2 feet, which means these levees that were 12 are now 10. So when they tell you, don't worry about a Category 3 storm because we have an 18-foot levee, you really don't. You got a levee that's a lot lower than that. And they're just now starting to realize that. This is the Mr. Go now. You can see how it's eroded. It started at 500 feet. In some areas, it's 2,000 feet wide. And as they keep digging it deeper to make the 36 feet, the sides keep collapsing in and it keeps getting wider and wider and wider. And as a result, the threat of water rushing in is all that much the greater. This is another view of it. You can see at one time it was separate from Lake Bourne. You can see this is the edge of Lake Bourne. Lake Bourne is falling into it. Pretty soon, as this erodes, this is to be a major gap right here. These are some of the articles. I'll go through this quick. St. Bernard Parish doomed. This is written in 1957. Mr. Roy was probably the only newspaper that was raising the legitimate questions. You know, he raises the questions of locks. There was supposed to have been locks built on it to keep salt water from coming in. That was part of the original plan, but those locks were never constructed. They're talking again about building locks. On this one over here, he raises concerns about traffic congestion because he's saying if you build this canal, you're making St. Bernard Parish an island. And think about it. You live on an island. Can you get home without crossing a bridge? No. You live on an island. A man-made island, because the industrial canal is man-made and Mr. Go is man-made. We're no longer part of Louisiana mainland. You're islanders. Enjoy it. He raised the issue of what was happened with the trapping industry. He realized that these things were very serious. The channel affect other fishing grounds in St. Bernard where thousands of people fish year-round. He was very concerned about this. He started about the potential of lawn last due to construction and operation of the Tidewater Channel. He also wondered about how much input other people are going to have, but the people didn't have much input because the Corps of Engineers and the people who saw this as an economic development tool and some of the people who owned the property around it were anxious to see this thing happen, so it went through. This is what a healthy cypress swamp looks like. Here's another view of one. This is what Chalmette used to be like. Here's another view. Look at the size of that cypress. There's another side. This is healthy. This is what she's supposed to be. Look at the size of this thing. And that's small. That's small because I had a friend of mine that worked for Bowie Lumber Company. I was in his office one day looking at pictures, and they had 4 men standing next to each other holding double-edged axes. And I'm looking at the picture, and I started staring at the picture, and I said, my God, Michael, I said, the background of that picture is a tree trunk. He says, yeah. 4 men standing next to each other. That's how wide the tree trunk was on the great cypress trees that used to be in Louisiana that have all been cut down and the wood sold elsewhere. This is what a cypress swamp looks like now. This is right off Paris Road. Look at that. You can just see the stumps. The few stumps that remain. Everything else is just underneath as the ground subsiding. It's sad. This here is kind of deceptive. This is going by a violet over the bridge. The reason you see so much green here is because you have the Gore pumping station there, which is pumping fresh water into the area and allowing things to grow. So otherwise, if you get beyond the Gore pumping station, you'll see. But all the big trees are dead. Stand after stand of dead cypress trees. This is what Annette was referring to in her poem about tombstones, great tombstones. These are your great tombstones. This is your cypress swamps. That was once thriving, beautiful forest. Look at the ducks. This is the population in 1978, 1994. That's the impact it's had on wildlife. It's incredible. Causes? The levee system has contributed to this because the replenishing power, as I mentioned before, the Mississippi River with both fresh water and sediment isn't taking place anymore because the levee system constrains the Mississippi and runs it off the mouth. Navigation canals like Mr. Go have carved up the marshes. Oil canals have contributed to the erosion of wetlands, allowing saltwater intrusion to get areas where it never got before. Oil drilling, okay, has caused a thing that they're now just starting to look at as regional depressurization. Think about it. You drill an oil well and you suck all the oil out. How many years have we been sucking oil out offshore? You take that oil out, the land's going to start sinking. You're depressurizing it because it was the pressure of that oil and gas that held that land up. It's like kind of pulling the rug out from underneath the coastline. So that process is taking place. You also have a general geological subsidence where there's a fault here and the ground is naturally sinking. And that's something that man has absolutely nothing to do with and can't have any control over. What we can do is mitigate these other problems. This one is nature. Local litigation has inhibited the efforts to replenish the marsh. If you remember the oyster suits that were out there, and I'm not picking on oystermen here, but the reality is a lot of federal money was brought in by John Breaux, Mary Landrieu, Billy Tozan to try to start rebuilding our marshes with these projects. But when over $1 billion lawsuit came down, the federal government said, I'm not putting money in Louisiana if it's going to go to a bunch of lawyers. We'll let them sort this thing out before we put anything in. So for about 2 years, this languished in court. Think about it. 2 years is 50 square miles of land that we lost. And of course, our good friends, the nutria. So you take all these things in consideration. These are a conglomerate. These are our problems. But is everything lost? No. St. Bernard Wetlands Foundation, Delta Wildlife, Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation, all of them are starting to realize how important it is. The Lake Pontchartrain Foundation at one time had Mr. Go as number 33 in this list of priorities, but then they started noticing that the salt was destroying swamplands and cypress swamps in Lake Maurepas, so far away. What could be the cause of this? They finally realized it was the saltwater intrusion from Mr. Go. Mr. Go is now number 1 on their list. The oil and gas industry have to get involved, and they're starting to recognize the damage they've done. Large landowners have to get involved. Trappers and fishermen. And sometimes you think they're together, but they have different views on how things should be done. The oystermen, we discussed them, because as the salt water starts coming in, oysters are being grown in areas where they weren't before. These men make their living off of this. All of a sudden, you open up a diversion canal and flush this fresh water into the area, like the Davis Diversion on Carnarvon. It wipes out their oyster reefs. This is their livelihood. So you see there's a balance taking place in all of this. Sports fishermen are another group. The government, the EPA, the Corps of Engineers, and concerned citizens. All of these individuals have ideas about what to do about it. The challenge for us as Louisianians is for you as young students, because let me tell you, you all are young, but the older you get, the less of Louisiana you're going to have, unless you do something about it. And the idea is you've got to harness the energies of all these people, get them working in a concerted effort to try to solve the problem. What do we have? The Lake Pontchartrain Foundation is set up to protect the lake, and it now recognizes it must address the problem of saltwater intrusion. Coast 2050 is a plan that came up to sustain parts of the coast, past Lucha, sediment mining, Davis Pond, Barrier Island restorations. They're starting to realize that if we don't take an aggressive stand, we're going to lose more and more of Louisiana. Coastal Wetlands Planning, Protection, and Restoration Act, that's the BRO Act. That was passed in 1990. Billions of dollars are supposed to come to Louisiana, but the question is, we haven't really come up with the plan that's going to work. And all these things, these plans that they have with diversion canals are fine, because the attempt is to try to solve the problem. But think about it. Any plan you come up with has got to do better than 25 square miles. If it does any less than that, all you're doing is slowing the slide. Okay? Why is New Orleans so vulnerable to a major hurricane? So we've talked about the wetlands, we've talked about how they were developed, we've talked about how they're disappearing, but all of you all went through Hurricane Ivan, you went through the evacuation, so why is it a problem? This is a satellite view. This is the city of New Orleans. This is Mr. Go coming up. Here's another view. This is the Gulf. This is the dead marsh area. When you get a storm that comes churning in, that's got a 30-foot tidal surge. And Hurricane Ivan, they measured offshore, the buoys, 65-foot waves. So you put a 65-foot wave on a 30-foot tidal surge, you've got 95 feet of water coming in. There's nothing to stop it. In the old days, with all that land, as it hit that marsh area, it would like a break. It would break it and it would spread out. But there's nothing stopping it now. When you get a sustained southeast wind, but from the southeast for about 3, 4, 5 days, go up on the Green Bridge, the Paris Road Bridge, and look out that direction and see what happens. You'll see that the only thing you have are the two levees, for the Intercoastal Canal and for Mr. Go. All the land in between is gone as just rollers of the Gulf coming up. And that's with something without even a name. That's how vulnerable we've become. This is an interesting graphic here. You know, you talk about New Orleans being a bowl. The lakeshore didn't always exist. I mean, you had a lakeshore, obviously, but it ran right here. This is the high area that's in white. So you can see the river, the highest area was right alongside the river. This here was Bayou Metairie. This here was Bayou Gentilly. Those bayous have now been closed over. Gentilly Road is on this. Metairie Road is on that. That's why those two roads are high when there's a storm. Back here, this was all marsh. In the 1920s, they built offshore here a seawall, and then they backfilled it, and they made it high. That's why it's white. So you see, it's high here, it's high here. That's the definition of a bowl. Once the water breaches and gets in here, you're not going to get it out. That was the concern with Hurricane Ivan, because some areas here are 25 feet below the levee, height of the levees. You would have 25 feet of water. They estimate it would take maybe 120 days to get the pumps working and 9 months to get the water out. So you got almost a year, the city of New Orleans would be underwater. That's why it was kind of frightening in the Weather Channel when they referred to New Orleans as Atlantis. Think about that. This is another elevation view showing the high areas in green, the low areas in yellow. The highest areas are in blue. This long, dark blue line, that's your Mississippi River levee system. This is the land that was deposited by the river that's high, and then it drops off gradually until you get closer to the lake. This interesting graphic here, what this is the Mississippi River. This is the city of New Orleans. You can see how deep the river is, by the way. The river is about 350 feet deep in some areas. And what all these lines are shot across the area of New Orleans. So if you take, for instance, line number 2, now let's take line number 1, right here to here. This is it up here. This shows the elevation from levee to levee. You see the difference? If you run a line there. This is line number 2. See how it goes? This is the top, that's the top. That's how much water you're going to have between these 2 points. That's what they mean by the bowl. Each one of these is a direction, is a shot across this thing on elevations to create it. See, this is interesting. This one here is right here. Okay? What that is, that's number 6. That's the levee on the industrial canal. That's why St. Bernard flooded so bad in Hurricane Betsy, because this acted as a natural levee where all that water filled up lower Ninth Ward in St. Bernard, but it couldn't cross that levee. But if you notice, about 3-4 weeks ago, when you had a heavy storm, you have the industrial canal, and then they've cleaned out all those marshes and everything, and those harbors and all the stuff, the buildings they have, and they got a flood wall built up. The water was all the way to the base of the flood wall. And this was with something that didn't even have a name on it. This is an aerial view here of Louisiana, and this is the area showing a couple of feet above sea level. It's kind of frightening, and you realize how much of it is below. This is just a map showing our location, and the danger is when hurricanes come in, they rotate in this direction. And what they do is they build that storm water ahead of them, and they force it in this direction right into our vulnerable area. And that's why people are so frightened when storms come in. Because if you look at a hurricane, it's turning in this direction. It's this northeast quadrant right here that is the single most dangerous, because the speed of the storm, you have to add to the speed of the wind. So if it's a 100-mile-an-hour wind and it's moving at 15 miles an hour, in this quadrant, you got a 115-mile-an-hour wind. 115-mile-an-hour wind can create heavy seas and a high tidal surge, and it drives it all into this area. Then, after it fills it all into Lake Pontchartrain and it moves down, since it's going in this direction, it becomes a north wind. So after piling all that water into Lake Bourne and Lake Pontchartrain, then the wind shifts as it passes up north of us and drives it over the levees and fills the city up. At the same time, if it passes here, it'll literally stop the flow of the Mississippi River going down, so the river starts backing up. That's what they're worried about. These are hurricane tracks. This is 1893, 1901. 1956. This is Hurricane Betsy. A lot of people think Hurricane Betsy passed over St. Bernard. It didn't. But we were in that northwest corridor. These tracks here, track F, track A, this is the killer track. If a storm comes through here and it's a category 3 or above, we're in a world of hurt. This is the idea of past storms. That's not all of them. But look at that. Oop, go back. Lost it. Go back. I'll tell you what, maybe do it this way. That's an easier way to do it. It's not if, it's when. Look how many of them come through here. And it's like you're walking around with a target painted on you, just that you've been dodging ball the whole time, you know. But one day, we're going to get it. So New Orleans is immediately vulnerable to the threat of a slow-moving Category 3 storm. But even should that not occur, southern Louisiana's future is in doubt. Coastal erosion caused by commercial canals and the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, and the inability of the delta to rejuvenate itself because of levee systems first begun in 1718, ensure that the metro area of New Orleans stands little chance of long-term survival, even if a major hurricane does not strike the area, unless something is done now. Thank you all. I hope you all found it interesting.